Well, we did ask the Treasury for an interview, but no one was available. With me now, Nicola Horlick, CEO of Bramdean Asset Management, and Sian, a Green councillor who's also standing to be Green candidate for Mayor of London. Let's just start with Mayor of London concept, because 17% of our GDP is down to financial services and banking. If you became mayor, or anybody became mayor, it'd be a pretty big job to ensure that that's sustained.
Well, I mean, as Mayor of London and as a candidate, I stood in 2008 as well. I've warned for a very long time that we actually rely too much on big financial institutions for our jobs growth. In 2007, we were predicting 68% of our new jobs would come from that sector. In reality, that hasn't happened, and we would have been much better off trying to grow other sectors. But, I mean, staying within finance, we do need to be diversifying away from these very big institutions. They do leave us vulnerable to restructures like this. We will be losing jobs. If they did leave, it would leave a hole. We ought to be filling that with things like the Green Party proposed in the general election manifesto, a network of local public banks. That's the sort of thing we ought to be seeing more of if HSBC do indeed leave.
Do you think, Nicola Horlick, that banker bashing has gone far enough?
I think it probably has, and I think we have to remember where this economy was in the early 1980s. And that's when the city began to grow at a very rapid rate, and it dug us out of an enormous economic hole. And it's not just about the people who are employed here, it's also the knock-on effect of those people earning substantial amounts of money and spending it in this country, which then helps other businesses. So if you've got large businesses domiciled here that are paying people well, there are lots of businesses and individuals who benefit from that.
But, you know, I can hear those viewers who watch Gogglebox screaming at the television and saying, but they also got us into a terrible economic hole.
Yes. I'm not necessarily...
You see, isn't that the worry? If we are so dependent on the banks, on financial services, we've already had one moment of catastrophe. Lots of people say it's perfectly possible to have another. Not enough has really happened to ensure that won't happen. And then we'd be back in the same mess. One
of the rationales for having a banking levy is to, in effect, make them pay some sort of premium, insurance premium, in case it happens again. And it's the whole idea of being too big to fail and governments having to come in and bail them out that worries people. And, of course, it's the taxpayer that has to bail them out. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have greater regulation and we shouldn't try and make banks behave more responsibly. But I think you've got to have balance in the argument and realise how important banking and financial services are as an industry to this country.
Sian, the difficulty is, of course, that if HSBC, for example, went, they would take an enormous wad of tax with them.
I mean, some tax, certainly. I think it's £700 million, which is a lot, but it's not breaking the Bank of England there. We have to remember that in the bailout of 2008, we made £500 billion available to these banks on condition that they did some more work, like lending to small businesses, and they haven't really fulfilled the promises that they made then. Small businesses in the UK, I've just been speaking to the Federation of Small Businesses this afternoon, they're really struggling to raise finance, especially when they want to grow from being small to being medium businesses. If we're going to diversify our economy, the big banks need to be working with us. They do need to be paying their taxes and taking part in the economy in a more responsible way.
Failure to support small and medium-sized businesses?
That has been an issue, and there hasn't been enough lending to small and medium-sized businesses over the last few years, and that's partly because of what happened in 2008 and new regulation, which actually is only going to get worse as we see Basel III being introduced, and it makes it very difficult for banks to lend on an unsecured basis to small businesses. That is true.
I mean, are you worried that, in fact, that would there be an infection? That's what everyone really wants to know. If HSBC went, would others follow?
Well, it's not so much others following. If you actually look at what's happened since 2008, if you look at what's happened with RBS, for example, it's had to scale back its operations enormously as a result of everything that's happened. And that is impacting the sector. That's why there hasn't been the growth that you might have expected in financial services. Also, there's been a lack of investment. So actually, when you look at the productivity figures, which are poor for the UK, financial services is one of the culprits in terms of poor productivity. society. And that's because of a lack of investment. Every day we hear about bank systems going down and people not being able to get money out of cash point machines and so on and so forth. And so actually what we need to do is encourage banks to invest, encourage banks to employ more people, not drive them out or make them reduce the scale of their businesses, because that's not good for our country.
We could marry both your position by saying you could indeed go off and grow other bits of the economy, but at the same time safeguard the banking sector, at least until you had enough income from other areas to make up for it.
I think that's absolutely true. And London will not stop being a financial centre. And we have some of the most talented finance people in the world here. It's not beyond their wit to create a more diverse financial sector, one that's more resilient and more interesting and does more for small businesses and local communities, invests in renewable energy. Those are things that we can do with public banks, with local banks, with clever new ways, peer-to-peer lending. All of that could be happening in London. We could be pioneering new ways of doing finance here. We don't want to just be relying on very, very big players who can threaten us and take their business away just because we want them to pay a little bit back into society.